Glenn Ford was born in 1949 in Shreveport, Louisiana, a city in the northwest part of the state. He was African American, living in a diverse community that was still heavily affected by racism, especially in the justice system. Ford worked as a gardener and handyman, often doing odd jobs to make ends meet. He was known as a hard-working, gentle man with no criminal record. One of his regular customers was Isidore Roseman, a white jeweler who owned a jewelry and watch repair shop in Shreveport. In the 1980s, Louisiana was still deeply affected by racism, especially in the criminal justice system. Black people were often treated unfairly, from suspicion and arrest to trial and sentencing. The jury system was often unrepresentative of the community, with many all-white juries in cases involving black defendants. In that context, Glenn Ford, a poor black man with no power or connections, becomes an easy target when a serious crime occurs. On November 5, 1983, Mr. Isidore Roseman was found shot to death in his store. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon was found, and no obvious signs of the perpetrator. However, Glenn Ford quickly became the prime suspect due to his previous working relationship with the victim. Ford voluntarily turned himself into the police station to assist in the investigation and maintained his innocence. However, police gathered some circumstantial evidence, including that Ford owned a gun similar to the murder weapon and had sold several pieces of jewelry similar to those stolen from Roseman's store. Guardian. Based on circumstantial evidence and testimony from several witnesses, including Marvella Brown, the girlfriend of one of the original suspects, police arrested Glenn Ford and charged him with first-degree murder. Brown later admitted to lying in his testimony. Ford was assigned 2 defense attorneys from a rotating roster of state attorneys. One was an oil and gas attorney who had never tried a criminal trial. The other was only 2 years out of law school and had no experience in major cases. The inexperience of the defense team left Ford with inadequate defense during his preparation for trial. In March 1984, less than 6 months after Isidore Roseman's death, Glenn Ford went on trial charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery. Although he maintained his innocence and was not present at the crime scene, the trial was hastily conducted. Ford was black, the victim was white, and the crime took place in a state with a history of racial segregation. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense and prejudiced. The first thing to note is that the jury was all white, even though Ford's community was nearly 50% black. The exclusion of black jurors was no accident. It was a deliberate tactic by prosecutors, who used peremptory strikes to ensure that people who might sympathize with Ford were not on the jury. This racial imbalance has led many to question the objectivity and fairness of the trial. But at the time, no one stood up to protest. Glenn Ford was assigned 2 pro bono attorneys from the court's roster. However, neither had tried a serious criminal case, and there was no budget to hire investigators, forensic experts, or rebuttal witnesses. Meanwhile, the prosecution had access to every resource, from seasoned investigators to forensic experts. This imbalance put Ford at a complete disadvantage. The defense did not even call a single witness in Ford's defense at trial. The murder weapon was never found, and no fingerprints or DNA linked Ford to the crime scene. But prosecutors relied on the testimony of 3 people, including Marvella Brown, the girlfriend of another suspect, who said Ford had told her boyfriend that he had killed Roseman. But years later, she admitted to lying to get her sentence reduced in an unrelated case. Additionally, Ford had owned a gun similar in style to the murder weapon and sold some jewelry similar to the stolen items. However, there is no evidence to prove that these were the victim's property. It is all speculation and coincidence. In their closing statements, prosecutors not only presented the evidence, but also appealed to emotion, painting the image of a dangerous black man who murdered a respectable white businessman. They emphasized that society needed to eliminate people like Ford, a frighteningly prejudiced reference. There was no chance for Ford to argue. With a biased jury, weak evidence, and incompetent counsel, a conviction was inevitable. On April 21st, 1984, after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Glenn Ford guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. He did not cry, he did not scream, he just bowed his head in silence. An innocent man was sentenced to death, without physical evidence, without neutral witnesses, and without a lawyer to defend him. Ford was sent to the Angola death camp, one of the most notorious prisons in the United States. He would live in an isolated cell, awaiting notification of his death every day. After being sentenced to death, Glenn Ford was transferred to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, which was dubbed the Alcatraz of the South, one of the most dangerous and brutal prisons in the United States. He was held in solitary confinement, less than 2 square meters in area, 23 hours a day. He lived in isolation with no contact with the outside world, no natural light, and only 1 hour a day in the yard, still in a fenced area. I didn't live, I just existed, Ford later shared. Every day was a battle in my head. I am innocent. Why am I here? In his early years, Ford was in despair. His family fell apart. His 2 sons grew up without a father. His mother died while he was still in prison. He was not allowed to attend the funeral. His spirit was broken. Instead of giving up, however, Glenn Ford chose to stand up. He spent years studying law, researching court cases, and writing hundreds of letters to human rights organizations, lawyers, journalists, and the Louisiana Supreme Court. Almost all were ignored. Ford didn't stop, though. I had to make my voice heard. I couldn't die in silence. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, organizations like the Innocence Project and a few independent journalists began to pay attention to the Ford case. They noticed serious irregularities. There was no physical evidence connecting Ford to the case. The main witness had a criminal record and inconsistent testimony. Important evidence, such as gun prints, was not fully tested. The lead prosecutor, Marty Stroud, was increasingly troubled by his conscience, but did not make it public at the time. However, the legal system has not moved to review the case. By the late 2000s, DNA testing technology began to be widely used in wrongful convictions. Glenn Ford once again filed a petition to have the evidence retested, but Louisiana authorities delayed it, citing a lack of suitable specimens. It wasn't until 2013 that the prosecutor's office agreed to review the case again. A new investigation was opened, this time by an independent internal unit. And then a turning point happened. In March 2014, after 30 years of waiting for death, Glenn Ford received shocking news. The district attorney's office confirmed Ford's innocence. The real person involved in Mr. Roseman's death was a suspect who had been named from the beginning but was not prosecuted because Ford had taken the stand for the crime. Testimony against Ford was found to be unreliable, and old evidence was reevaluated to show there was no basis for his conviction. Shortly thereafter, the court overturned the death sentence. On March 11, 2014, Glenn Ford was released after 29 years, 3 months, and 5 days behind bars. When he walked out of the Angola prison gates, he was 64 years old. On March 11, 2014, Glenn Ford walked out the gates of Angola prison after nearly 30 years on death row. But instead of feeling elated, he just said quietly, "I went out, but I was no longer the person I used to be." At 64, Ford had virtually no family left. He relied on the help of volunteers and organizations that helped the wrongly convicted. He had no money, no home, and no job. The world had changed dramatically in the 3 decades he had been incarcerated. Ford filed a lawsuit against the state of Louisiana for $330,000, the maximum allowed by law, $40,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment. However, Louisiana refused, citing that Ford had not been clean during the early years of his arrest because he was involved in the sale of stolen property. Although this was unrelated to the murder case, the state used it as an excuse to not pay. Ford continued to file lawsuits, but the lawsuit was lengthy and involved many complicated procedures. He told the press, "They didn't just steal my youth. They refused to recognize me as a human being worthy of compensation." One of the most shocking moments was when Marty Stroud, the lead prosecutor in the 1984 case, publicly apologized to Glenn Ford. In an article in the Shreveport Times, Stroud admitted, "I helped put an innocent man in prison for 30 years. I was too confident, too arrogant. I didn't mean to do evil, but I let my career be more important than justice." Stroud added that the legal system he served had failed. If Glenn Ford, a man with no money, no proper lawyer, no political power, can be wrongly sentenced to death, then anyone can be next. Stroud's apology was welcomed by the community, but for Ford, it wasn't enough. "I appreciate his honesty, but an apology doesn't make up for the time I lost." Just months after his release from prison, Glenn Ford was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Doctors told him he had only months to live. The treatment was expensive and painful, and he had no health insurance or financial resources. Despite his near-death experience, Ford continued to appear at conferences, universities, and give interviews to the press to tell his story. He wanted to be a voice for innocent people who were being held captive. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. No one deserves it, not even my enemies." On June 29, 2015, just over a year after his release, Glenn Ford died at the age of 65. He died in a care home for the poor, with no family by his side and only a few friends from his legal aid organization. When he died, the state of Louisiana had not paid a penny in compensation. He was said to be a free man, but never lived as a truly free man. His story, however, did not disappear with him. It became a symbol of the cruelty of the American criminal justice system and a powerful reminder about the death penalty and human rights. Glenn Ford's case is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a deeply flawed criminal justice system. When we look closely, we see a number of factors that came together to create this disaster of justice. Weak defense attorneys. Glenn Ford was assigned 2 attorneys with no serious criminal experience, having never tried a death penalty case. All-white jury. In a case where the defendant is black, the systematic exclusion of people of color from the jury raises questions of fairness. Police and prosecutors concealed evidence. There are documents showing they knew Ford was not the prime suspect, but did not present them in court. Systemic racism. In Shreveport, Louisiana in the 1980s, black-on-white murder cases were often judged more harshly and more quickly than other cases. All of this leads to a burning question. If not Glenn Ford, how many other Glenn Fords are behind bars? Ford's case is considered one of the strongest arguments against the death penalty in the United States. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, more than 190 people who were sentenced to death have been exonerated since 1973. But thousands more are on death row, and no one can guarantee that none of them are innocent. As Brian Stevenson, human rights lawyer and author of Just Mercy, once said, "I would rather let 100 guilty people live than let one innocent person be executed." Glenn Ford's death not only sparked debate about the death penalty, but also opened up broader debates about how to appoint public defenders. There must be strict standards and adequate funding to ensure that the poor also have effective advocacy. How to select a jury. Don't disqualify people based on race. Something that still happens in subtle ways. Transparency in investigation. Hiding evidence or deliberately leading the investigation toward conviction is a violation of professional ethics and criminal law. Some states, such as New York, Illinois, and New Jersey, have abolished the death penalty. partly because of high cost and the risk of wrongful convictions. But many others, such as Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama, still retain it. Despite losing 30 years of his life, Glenn Ford did not give up. He did not cry out for hatred, but chose to speak the truth to protect others. His story has been covered in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, and featured in numerous documentaries, including Death Row Stories, CNN, True Justice, Bryan Stevenson's Fight for Equality, HBO. Many law students say they chose law because of his story. His name appears in classes on criminal law, judicial reform, and human rights, demanding justice, even though it is too late. Some say that Glenn Ford was free before he died, after all. But for a man robbed of everything, youth, family, health, and honor, freedom late is never enough. Imagine he leaves prison with gray hair, a weak body, and a changed world. He cannot relive the lost years, cannot watch his children grow up, cannot live a normal life like everyone else. Justice is not just about declaring who is right and who is wrong. Justice is about righting wrongs, protecting the weak, and doing what is right when no one else dares. And Glenn Ford, through his own painful story, has become a powerful voice for that justice.